Well, Ming, my first question really is, how are you? How is life on the backbenches after, you spent so long in the front line, as a front bencher, as party leader? How are you finding things now?
Well, the weekends are back. I mean, one of the disadvantages of politics in this country is that apart from those in Parliament and a small number of people in the party, politics is a volunteer activity. And volunteers work during the week, and they want to do politics on Saturdays. If you're Scottish, you can still hold out against Sunday, but only just. So a lot of my time was spent at the weekends away from home. So now I go home and spend time with my family and my grandchildren, do have a bit of time for thinking. And, I mean, more broadly, I've gone on the Foreign Affairs Committee of the House of Commons. I've just published my biography. There's no signing session afterwards, you'll be glad to know. I've gone on the board of an investment trust, and I'm trying to persuade an American university to make me a visiting professor. So
that sounds very full.
There's plenty to do. And I'm out at front line, for heaven's sake.
Yes, yes.
Can I just say I'm astonished by the location of these premises. On the one side, there's a shop that sells baby food, and on the other, there's a shop that sells adult entertainment. I wondered if this was a reflection on some of the appetites of journalists.
Is it a relief to be out of the spotlight?
It's different. It's different. I mean, you miss the sense of being at the centre of events. And if you've been as engaged in politics as I have for so long, then that's something about which you obviously have some regrets. But I don't miss Prime Minister's question time on Wednesdays at 12 o'clock. And I feel that I've got rather more control of my own life. I mean, my day was divided up into half-hour meetings. Not much time for thinking.
No spontaneity?
Not much.
Everything was timetabled?
Yeah, timetable, because the only way you could do it. And in our party, and I suspect it's the same in other parties, every time there's a crisis or even a minor problem, the resolution of that somehow finds itself across the desk of the leader of the party. I fought quite hard to try and change that in our party, because, as I said, I was the opposite of the harlot. I had responsibility without power, because you have responsibility for a lot of these issues, but in a party as democratically devolved as the Liberal Democrats, you can't always get your own way.
And you found that frustrating?
It's very frustrating indeed. Not that I'm a kind of dictator monkey, but it's just that if you have the responsibility for something, then it's very irksome not to have the power to change it if you think it needs to be changed.
I'll come back to that a little later. It is about 6 months since you stepped down as leader. When you look back at that time of being under all that pressure, how do you view it now?
Well, Ian Aiken, famous political editor of The Guardian, said of politics, he said, politics is a rough old trade. And it is. And I look at my friend Gordon Brown and see what's happened to him in recent weeks. And I look at David Cameron and see what was happening to him last summer.
Over grammar schools.
Over grammar schools, yeah. I mean, politics in this country has become increasingly presidential. It's increasingly, if you like, a personality and to some extent celebrity-driven. And you know, if you can't stand, if you don't accept that that's going to be the consequences of being engaged in the front line of politics, then you shouldn't be doing it. That's what was it Harry Truman said: if you can't stand the heat, stay out of the kitchen. So my principal regret is not having had the chance to fight a general election. Because when I was elected leader, there were 3 things I felt I had to do. The first was to restore a sense of balance and stability and purpose in the party following Charles Kennedy's resignation. The second was to make the party more professional internally in what it did, sort of thing that not seen by political commentators or the public, but vitally important if you're going to operate effectively in this era of 24-hour-a-day news. And the third thing was to prepare the party for a general election. And we had done all that. The manifesto was written, my programme was pretty well penciled in. If Gordon Brown had called the election, we were ready to go. But he decided not to. And at that point, I had to ask myself, if this election is held in 2010, as I now think it will, and that was before I had any inkling of the extent of the credit crunch and the damage to Brown's reputation for economic competence. If it's held in 2010, as I now think it will be, then I'll be 69. Mm-hmm. And although John McCain is 2 or 3 years older than me, there's not the same deference to age in this country as there is in the United States. And I've been thinking about that quite hard, and I think one of the reasons is that in the United States they elect a head of state, and being chief executive is something not some presidents. I mean, Clinton was a chief executive, Ronald Reagan wasn't. Lyndon Johnson most certainly was, not a very good one as it happens. And I think the Americans have a different view then about age and experience, because they think they're electing someone to represent their country as much as to run it. And that's particularly true, of course, in a federal system where so much is run by individual states. But we don't have that view in Britain. And I think we do have, I would say this, wouldn't I? We do have an obsession with age, with youth. And as I will say, with youth comes, with age comes experience and judgment. And on an issue like the Iraq War, which I've no doubt we may come to,
certainly will.
Then it seems to me, with a bit of age, a bit of judgment, a bit of experience, then Britain would not have embarked upon what many people regard as the most serious foreign policy failure since Suez in 1956.
The media was very cruel about your age, and there were some terrible caricatures, and that all goes without saying.
If I had a fiver for every caricature of me with a Zimmer, I'd be very rich.
It wasn't very original.
No, it's not. Well, that's the other thing, point I was going to make. Cartoons are cliches. I had never thought about this, but these cartoons are cliches. No cliche is left unturned by cartoonists. No. Which I think, I mean, it doesn't say much for subtlety or, if you like, intellectual understanding.
No, that I'm sure people would agree with that. But there was also the very unavoidable fact that the party was going down in the polls. It was really, I seem to remember, an 11%. I just wanted to ask you.
I mean, a Mickey Mouse poll.
We can quibble about that, but I wanted to ask you whether...
No, we can't, because ICM is the poll in which we regularly strike between 18 and 22%. And that's a poll in which people are asked, which party would you vote for? And the parties are named. It's not a poll which requires people to use their computers and register their opinion independently. But you're right. A perception had arisen that we were having difficulty in the polls.
And there was nothing that you could do to counter that?
If I'd stood on my head in Parliament Square and recited Shakespeare, it still wouldn't have been enough. I mean, because a perception grows up. And the question you have to ask yourself was, can I trade out of this? If you can't trade out of it, then that's the point at which you have to say, well, should I go on? And when I asked myself both of these questions, I had negative answers.
I mean, I wonder whether it goes back to what you were saying about British politics being very much about celebrity, about theatre, about spectacle, and whether that was eventually something that you couldn't do.
Well, I can't do theatre.
You recognised you couldn't do that.
Yeah, I mean, Tony Blair had a choice. He either went into politics or he went on the London stage. Now, I'm slightly overstating the case. I don't do theatre. And Gordon Brown doesn't do theatre.
He's not doing very well.
No, he's not. But I think there are other reasons for that. It's not just
of course, but it's part of the mix.
Yeah, it's become part of the mix, and you have to ask yourself, you know, who do you want? Do you want Laurence Olivier or do you want Winston Churchill? Actually, he did a bit of theatre too.
I think he did.
There was a bit of the ham about some of those wonderful speeches. But I think that there really is a question here about this. I mean, for example, I think there are some representatives from abroad here, aren't there? Angela Merkel doesn't do theatre. And yet, in international affairs, she has been enormously powerful. More difficult domestically, but that's because of the rather curious result and this sort of coalition of the two main parties. She doesn't do theatre, but by God, she's done extremely well in restoring the position of federal Germany in the world. And you have to ask yourself then, you know, what's important, theatre or substance?
Do you feel any differently 6 months on from the way you did then, is there anything that you could have done differently, do you think, to have maintained your position?
I don't believe so. But look, you know, the dogs bark and the caravan moves on. I mean, it's very important. I think it's very important not to dwell on the past. I mean, I've been very lucky in my life, as I say in this book that I've available, £20, Hodder and Stoughton.
Okay.
I went and did something the other day with Mike Jackson, you know, the famous British general with the wonderful bags under his eyes, for the BBC, as it happened. And he was asked a question. He said, yes, it's all in my book, 75,000 copies sold. You can get it for 25 quid, and I'll be doing a book signing in a little while. I'm not quite as brazen as that.
Very good.
But, I mean, I've had 3 lives, sport, the law, and politics. And I regard myself as having had the enormous opportunity. And that was one of the things which motivated me in politics, because there are just as good lawyers who never got a chance, and they're just as good as sports people, sportsmen and women, who never got a chance, never got the opportunity, and they're just as good politicians who never got the opportunity either. And therefore, it's not that I'm complacent, but I'm content that I've had chances in life which many people haven't had. And I think one should be not so much grateful for that, but content by it. And so I don't feel, my frustration and irritation is not having fought a general election as the leader of the party, because I think that would have played to some of my strengths. I think I would have enjoyed it. I think the party would have done very well.
I've been reading your book, and what's been quite marked is the contrast between what happened to you and what happened to Charles Kennedy, about whom you write, you know, at some length. Because, as you've just said, you achieved a lot in policy terms. You changed the party's taxation policy, made it much more green. You started this internal reorganisation that you talk about. And yet, your personal ratings and the party's ratings went down. Charles Kennedy, we know everything that was going on behind the scenes that were, you know, covered up by many people, yourself included. His ratings went on being pretty high. I mean, that was, it could strike you as a, you know, a bit of a bitter irony, really.
Well, I don't see it as that. I mean, I'm not Charles Kennedy, and he's not me.
But it's quite a contrast that comes out.
It's comparing apples with pears. And if you get these you get these chances, you have to do them to the best of your ability. And I'm satisfied that during that period I did everything I possibly could to the best of my ability. And if that was not enough, then the sensible thing to do was to recognise that and to leave the stage so that someone else could try and do better.
And there were people who said at the time that although the caricatures were about your age, it wasn't really about your age, it was about your style. Do you think that there's any truth in that?
You mean the fact I wear a collar and tie? Maybe. But, you know, this is back to this whole question of substance as opposed to form. And
I don't think that they would deny that.
We are.
That's
I mean,
right.
for God's sake, William Hague put a baseball cap on back to front. It destroyed his reputation because he tried to be something he wasn't. And no one's quicker than the British public to recognise that people are putting on an act. I mean, for God's sake, David Cameron cycling to Westminster and as a demonstration of his environmental credentials with a motor car behind carrying his briefcase. Well, no, you know, on any view, trying not to be too partisan about these matters. I mean, what is that?
Yeah.
I mean, and also there's a sort of naivety of imagining that these things won't come out.
Yeah.
I mean, if you behave in a false way, then sooner or later someone will suss that out, and you will be much more embarrassed as a result. I mean, the one point, perhaps, if I might just be, I mean, I was determined that I would go in my own time and on my own terms.
Yes, which you did.
Yeah. And it was my decision. And I took that decision in, if you like, full possession of my faculties and with an understanding of what I thought the party then needed. And it seemed to me that I couldn't provide what the party then needed. And if you've spent as long as I have in the Liberal Party, Liberal Democrats, then you have a sense of what the party requires.
And it was a decision out of the blue for everybody who was watching.
Yeah, sure.
Did you decide that day, that night?
Clearly I'd been thinking about it
Of course.
for some time. But the decision to go was entirely mine, to the extent that when I rang my wife and said, I'm going to resign, she said, at Christmas? And I said, no, now.
Yeah.
She said, what? I said, yes, I'm coming home this afternoon. And her first thought, she said, there's nothing in the fridge, she said. Very practical woman, my wife. Actually, there was something in the fridge. But, I mean, that was my decision. And if I have to take responsibility for it, I take responsibility for it.
And what triggered it that day?
There were 10 days. We had a very successful party conference. I mean, this is not very modest, but I made a speech which got very good headlines the following day. The opinion polls were looking quite good. I then did a kind of trip roundabout. I went off to Rochdale and did a dinner for the local Liberal, 150 people, standing ovation. I went to one of our local party conferences, regional conferences, about 250, 300 people, standing ovation. I did a session on question time, and after question time, one of the other panelists texted a friend of mine to say Ming was brilliant. And when I opened the newspaper the next morning, it said, lackluster performance by a Liberal Democrat leader. And I counted up, there were 10 consecutive days, of which there were 10 consecutive stories in the broadsheets saying I wasn't cutting the mustard. And at that point, I said to myself, well, this is what I've had this, if you like, good 10 days, fortnight, and it's making absolutely no impact on these perceptions. So, there's nothing more important in politics than realism. And I said to myself, realistically, I can't trade out of this. If I can't trade out of it, it's bad for the party. So I went.
And you took that decision pretty quickly. It was pretty abrupt.
Yeah, sure. But you know, when it's there to be taken, you take it. It's not to say all decisions in politics are easy. I mean, on for example, Iraq, which I mentioned before, I mean, we had quite a lot of sleepless nights, Charles Kennedy and I, separately, let me hasten to say, because to line up against the view of the government of the day, which, if it prevails in the House of Commons, will mean that young men and young women are going to risk their lives in implement of a government policy. It's actually quite a serious thing to do. And the Black Watch recruit in my constituency. And they, as you know, at various times have and will continue to be in the front line. And there is a sense always, when people go to war, that they should feel that the public, that the community, that those in positions of responsibility are wholeheartedly behind them. So to stand out and say, we think it's wrong, you shouldn't do it, we thought it was the right thing to do. But we realized that there were, I suppose, issues of principle, issues of morality, issues also, I suppose, of political expediency, heavily engaged in making a decision of that kind. But I never felt more proud of our party than when, together, 2003, we went, the only party to go together. There were others from other parties, but there were splits, if you like. We went into the No Lobby. And I found myself in the No Lobby with Robin Cook, for whom I have an enormous admiration, the most powerful figure in British politics, sadly no longer with us. With Kenneth Clarke, Tory, a man for whom I have enormous admiration, a man of immense common sense and a great deal of charisma. And I found myself with politicians from other parties with whom I was instantly in sympathy. And that helped, I think, to reinforce the judgment that the decision we'd taken was the right one.
I mean, let's talk about Iraq. What is your assessment of the situation now? The surge seems to have worked to a certain extent.
Yeah, but look, the figures have crept up again in the last 2 or 3 weeks. By June, the Americans are scheduled to take 5 divisions out, go from 20 to 15. Petraeus has argued against that. It looks as if Bush is going to go along with it. But the strain on the American military is absolutely enormous. And there are real questions as to whether or not they can sustain As far as the British are concerned, you may have heard the reports this evening. The Americans have been out and about in Basra helping the Iraqi government, but the Brits have stayed on the airport. So then you have to ask yourself this question: what political or military objective is being served by the continued presence of British troops in Iraq? I cannot myself find any legitimate answer to either of these questions. And that's why approximately 13, 14 months ago we produced a plan, a document for a phased withdrawal over something like 4 to 6 months.
And you still stick by that?
Yes,
you
I
think
do.
that's
well,
the thing,
yeah, things have changed. I mean, things have changed, but look, sooner or later the Iraqis have got to run their own country. Sooner or later they have to take responsibility for themselves. It's longer now from the 18th of March 2003 to today's date than it was from Dunkirk to the end of the war in Europe, in the Second World War. I mean, that's the measure of the commitment. Now, of course, the casualties have been nothing like that, nothing like those of the Second World War. But we've lost a lot of brave young men and women in a cause which, in my view, was based on a flawed prospectus, was illegal, was deeply divisive in the country. And you have, I mean, you know, just as I was claiming realism when I stepped down, I think you have to claim realism about this deployment. I'm going to the United States in a fortnight or so. And the numbers there, as you know, the biggest cheer Hillary Clinton gets now is when she says within 100 days I will have a plan for the withdrawal of American forces from the American forces from Iraq. And we shouldn't determine everything by public opinion. But if public opinion drains away from a military deployment of that kind, which has cost an enormous amount in treasure, an enormous amount in lives, and in our case, and the Americans' case too, an enormous amount in influence, then you've got to be realistic about it.
What do you foresee in terms of a change of American president? Obviously, it depends on who gets it. If it's McCain, it's probably more of the same. But how do you assess that?
I mean, I think it's fascinating, absolutely fascinating. I've never met Obama, but I've met Hillary Clinton. Immensely impressive. I mean, she has got real presence. She may be 5'2" or whatever the hell it is, but she's got enormous presence. And I know McCain's very, very slightly, because I know Joe Lieberman, who's his sort of alter ego in the Senate. You know, the Democrat who went independent and still held onto his seat. I know him rather better. And so McCain's character, I think, is almost in the best American tradition. War hero, clarity of mind, independent. This is the man who wants to outlaw waterboarding, which of course is the technique used by the CIA. And why he knows about torture, sure as hell he does, because he was held up by his arms, hung by his arms by the North Vietnamese. And I think that either against Obama or against Hillary Clinton could well be quite attractive. And remember, the Americans are quite good at this notion of checks. They know about checks and balances. Not only is it constitutional, but they have a political sense of it. And I think the Democrats will win the Senate. I think the Democrats will win the House. But it wouldn't be beyond the American public to put a Republican in the White House so that the checks and the balances are established.
But if that were to happen, then the situation in Iraq is unlikely to change immediately.
And I think that would raise particular issues for Gordon Brown or for David Cameron.
Yes, indeed, whoever it is.
And if it's the other way around, and it's Hillary, I think she will do the 100 days. She'll seek to have some plan for the 100 days. I think Barack Obama, in my view, talks a little naively about it. But the one thing about being the American president, if you ring people up and offer them a job, by and large, they tend to take it. And so one's hope and one's belief is that in either case they would be surrounded by people who are sufficiently savvy, if you like, to carry the policy through. One of the great defects that George W. Bush demonstrated, of course, was his unwillingness to bring in the people who'd be father, James Baker and Brent Scowcroft and people of that stature. And if he'd had some of them in the White House, or taken advice from them rather than from the Richard Pearl and the neocons, then perhaps the Americans would not have found themselves in the position they do now.
Can I just bring you back to Britain and Iraq? Do you not think it is politically much more difficult for Gordon Brown to pull troops out while Basra remains in the uncertain position that it is? You must be able to see that. I understand the party's position, but it's very difficult for him.
But when will be the right time? When will be the right time? What point will we... I mean, this is where McCain talked about Americans being in Iraq for 100 years. I mean, of course he didn't mean 100 years. What he meant was ours is an open-ended commitment. We can't afford an open-ended commitment. Not least, of course, because of all of this stuff, where there is legitimate purpose, where there's a deployment which is capable of success. And that is being prejudiced by the strain which Iraq is putting on our armed forces. I mean, it's hard. It's hard. This is what the Americans call hard ball. I mean, this is not easy. But you've got to make cold, rational assessments. And of course, withdrawal. And let me tell you, you take 4,500 troops out of Basra. You don't do it overnight. You have to construct what's called force protection to make sure that you don't lose anyone coming out, because as soon as your adversary knows you're going, you're at your most vulnerable. And not only that, you will want to make sure you don't leave anything behind that can be used for the purposes of civil war. Withdrawal is not, if deciding to withdraw is not an easy option, then conducting withdrawal is an even more difficult option. It will not be easy, but my view is it's what should be set in motion.
And in Afghanistan, our commitment there is open-ended?
Except we're operating in a rather different context, I believe. We have the lawful authority of the United Nations. We have NATO. We're not alone, although the strains within NATO, as some of you may know, are becoming very, very considerable. Canadians, for example, have taken more casualties proportionately than any other country. And you have the situation in which it's the Americans, the Brits, the Canadians, the Danes, and the Dutch who are willing to do the hard fighting, what you might call the mud and bullets, or in this case the sand and bullets. And that has brought strain within NATO, some of which emerged in Bucharest just the other day at the NATO summit. But Afghanistan's capable of being won to a point at which...
You said that very confidently.
Yes, well, I rely upon the judgment of people like General David Richards, who was the British general who was the overall NATO commander. It's capable, not that we're necessarily winning it, but it's capable of being won if we have the right resources and if we have the right commitment from all of the NATO countries.
Should we be talking to the Taliban?
James Baker, who wrote the Iraqi study group report along with Lee Hamilton in the United States, said you should always be willing to talk to your enemies. And I think that principle is entirely sensible. You don't necessarily negotiate with them. You don't offer them concessions, but you should go and state your position. Tell them what our position is. And our position is that there's a democratic government under President Karzai, and our determination is to ensure that that government survives, that it is sustainable, and that, so far as is possible, the people of Afghanistan enjoy an enhanced standard of living, democratic accountability, all of those things. That's not to say that we're going to turn Afghanistan into a model John Stuart Mill republic or anything like that. But it's capable. It's capable of being achieved.
I'm going to bring you back to the Liberal Democrats in 2008. People look at Nick Clegg and say, yes, fine, but not really yet made his mark. Do you sympathise with him? What do you feel about his performance, being as frank as you can, though of course I know you'll be loyal?
Turn the cameras off. Turn them on. Look, leadership is not easy. Tony Blair came in with a majority of 160, with a Conservative Party that was totally disillusioned and demoralised, and with a Liberal Democrat Party which was very sympathetic to most of his objectives, as Paddy Ashdown's diaries reveal in very considerable detail.
The cooperation that was
Cooperation that was going on before, and indeed after, because we voted for their Queen's speech.
Yes.
Which was quite an extraordinary thing to do. So leadership is, if you come in circumstances like that, leadership is a hell of a lot easier than in other circumstances. And Nick Clegg has come in at a time when the Conservatives are enjoying a period of apparent success. But the important thing to remember, and it's as much a part, I think, of British politics as Cameron's success, which could be ephemeral, as I've already talked about the events of last summer, when grammar schools suddenly put the whole issue of his leadership under scrutiny.
But he's had a period of
course, since then, yes, sure.
The trend is still
I'm
up
allowing
now.
that. I'm allowing that. I'm allowing that. In the 1951 election, 2% of the British electorate voted for parties other than the two major parties. There was a music hall joke, and the Liberal lost his deposit. In 2008, it's clear that there is a core vote ranging between 18 to 22% of people who support the Liberal Democrats. And that is a very substantial advance, and it's a platform upon which Nick Clegg is more than capable of taking the party further. And let me just acknowledge, as I say that, the contribution made by Charles Kennedy in getting us the best result that we have had for the third party since 1921 or 1922. So we are stronger, we are fitter, we are more numerous, and so all of the ingredients are there for further success. And I'm confident that Nick Clegg will achieve that.
One of the things you did while still leader was to discuss what the party should do in the event of a hung parliament. The polls show that that is still perfectly possible. What should the party do?
Well, you better ask Nick Clegg that question.
But you, from your position now, what should it weigh up?
Well,
Is it still about PR?
I mean, because you've asked me this question on air, and we are on air. You've asked me this question on air before. I tell you what the party should do. The party should aim for the maximum number of Liberal Democrat votes and the maximum number of Liberal Democrat seats. And after the election, then consider the options. It's presumptuous, I think, for politicians really to answer that question. No, because it's for the electorate to decide. I happen to be one of those who thinks that I'm not a statistician, but I'm not impressed by the statistical probability of a hung parliament. I think when the moment comes, the British electorate is likely to vote, as it were, one way or the other.
Why do you think that?
Well, we've never had a hung parliament in this country, really. We've had in the 1920s, and I suppose you might say in the February election of 1974, there was a kind of uncertainty about the outcome. I just don't think that you can't. Well, I mean, just to go back slightly to answer your question about the Lib Dems, you can't campaign for a hung parliament. And we tried that actually in '83 and '87, the SDP Liberal Alliance. It got us absolutely nowhere.
No, but you can prepare for it, and I think you were doing that.
And you'd have been very surprised if I hadn't been preparing for it.
But you won't tell us in what way.
Considering the options, in particular considering the constitutional implications. But the one thing I did say, two things I said. One is it is not about seats in the cabinet, or as it's rather vulgarly put, bums in ministerial mondeos. It's about policies. And the issue has got to be what is in the best interest of the country, not in the best interest of the Liberal Democrats. These were the two things I was willing to vouchsafe. But you'd have been astonished if I'd said to you we did no preparatory work.
No, I would have
been. I mean, if we were as close as I think we were to a general election last October, then it was essential that we had done some staff work, if you like, to prepare ourselves for all of the possible outcomes.
And should proportional representation...
Don't lift the phone.
Don't lift the phone?
Don't lift the phone, Gordon.
Unless
David,
that's on
don't lift the phone
agenda.
if it's not proportional
Right.
representation. Because we've been there. The Blair response to all of that was to set up a commission under Roy Jenkins, who produced an entirely sensible report, which is in a pigeonhole in the Home Office gathering dust. Yeah. And don't lift the phone unless... That's my advice to Nick. He should say to both Gordon Brown and David Cameron, don't even bother lifting the telephone unless proportional representation is on the agenda. And there's you talk about my book. There's an exchange there. My wife talking to John Major at an event after the wreath laying at the Cenotaph, and John Major said to my wife, "I suppose Ming's talking, or I suppose David Cameron's talking to Ming." To which my wife said, "Well, no, as a matter of fact, he's not." To which John Major very quickly said, "Well, I suppose it's proportional representation," implying that that was the stumbling block.
That's the stumbling block, yeah. I've got many more questions, but I think given the time, I'll stop there and throw it open to the floor. There's a microphone that will come round, so please, if anyone's got any questions, do please put your hands up. And it doesn't have to be on anything that we've discussed, you know, anything. Gentleman right there.
Thank you very much. Ian Orr, biodiplomacy. I used to work in the Foreign Office. I had a couple of questions. Well, one was a general one about where you see the strengths and the weaknesses of, well, the three main parties being able to agree on broad lines of foreign policy, which clearly we didn't have in Iraq. But what are the general considerations, you know, that can make you work for that and against it? But then a very specific question, and it's one that I know you know about from your work on the Foreign Affairs Committee, and that is, do you think it's realistic for the three main British parties to agree, probably after the American election, that the Chagossians who were exiled from their islands in the Indian Ocean should be able to go back to resettle on the outer islands, and for the Americans to accept that this poses no threat whatsoever to their strategic interests in the Indian Ocean?
Well, on the second of these, if I can deal with that specifically, we're taking evidence at the moment. We've had some evidence, we're still taking evidence, and the Foreign Affairs Committee will issue a report in due course. I think it would be wrong for me to second guess that, but I think the way in which you framed your question implied that you thought that that would not be an unreasonable outcome. And I have considerable sympathy with that, because I think it's possible from a security point of view that cohabitation of that kind could be achieved. I do have a question in my mind about the sustainability of the lives of the Chagossians in those circumstances, and the degree of financial and logistical and other support which would be required if that's what happened. But the committee has, Foreign Affairs Committee has taken a lot of evidence, we're still taking it, and some of us have requested the opportunity to pay a visit to Diego Garcia, from which we might be sufficiently well informed to reach a judgment about the question you've asked. Now, on the generality, I mean, I thought, go to America at the same time as the Pope, hardly surprising, you don't get much coverage, and therefore I thought it was disappointing that Gordon's speech about American leadership and foreign policy got such little coverage, because if you read it carefully, then I think it's a very well-crafted speech with quite a lot of sensible things to say. And I have a kind of an obsession about this, because if you think in the immediate post-war period, Harry Truman and Dwight Eisenhower, a Democrat and a Republican, fashion the rules-based system which we have come to accept. The United Nations, the IMF, the World Bank, all of that was American leadership. Create a rules-based system, which is not perfect, but is a hell of a lot more perfect than any of the alternatives. And of course it was that system which was damaged, breached, by the decision to take military action against Iraq without express United Nations authority, and at a time when Dr. al-Baradei and Hans Blix were saying we can still go on with our inspections. It's not easy, but we're not being thwarted, and we can reach a conclusion in due course. Now, my view is that a rules-based system is the only basis upon which you can conduct foreign affairs. It's not perfect. I'm perfectly clear about that in my own mind, but it needs the leadership of the United States, and in particular it needs the leadership of the United States in relation to the United Nations. And we passed from a period where we had a Secretary General of the UN of great personal standing and charisma, not infallible, as he readily admitted in relation to Rwanda, when he was in charge of the Department of Peacekeeping, and he allowed the troops, allowed the UN presence to be reduced and indeed withdrawn. But the influence of the United Nations, I think, is crucial if we're going to, if you like, re-establish a world order. And I'm not convinced at the moment that the present Secretary General carries with him either the experience or the clout, particularly on Capitol Hill, to bring that about. And I think, therefore, that the sort of imperative of the United States taking leadership in that area is overwhelming. Now, that is something around which all three of the major political parties could agree. I wish we could agree about Europe. You've got us, who are the most enthusiastic. You've got Gordon, who wants to sign the Lisbon Treaty, but not in public. You've got the Tories, who are riven. I'm trying not to be too party political about it, on this whole issue. I wish we could be more together on Europe, because my own view, it's a kind of classic liberal 50s, 60s view about Europe, is that the United Kingdom, properly engaged in Europe, would have much more influence, could help to fashion the Europe in which we were much more comfortable. We don't have that. But internationally, I think the United Nations still represents the best possible vehicle. And if we can persuade the Americans that they should be not perhaps putting petrol in the tank, but liquefied petroleum gas, since that is more environmentally friendly, then that is the thing which all three of the parties could unite about, about which they could be effective. The interesting question is the extent to which, of McCain, I think he's a classic Republican. I think that's going to be very difficult. We've really dealt with this before, but I think it's very difficult for him to be as pro-UN as I would prefer. Of Hillary and Barack Obama, I think there's a possibility, and therefore there is a sense. It's not for Brits to interfere in the internal elections of other countries, but there is a sense in which, if that's one's objective, then the return of a democratic president would be much more likely to bring about that objective.
There was a question over there in the corner, I think.
Fred Moore, no affiliation. Ming, I was just wondering...
how did you get in here if you have no affiliation?
I was just wondering what you think about Zimbabwe, and whether there's anything the international community can actually do about this terrible situation.
Yeah. I was in South Africa a fortnight ago, after the elections, while there was this period of nothing happening. I think enormously complicated. It's the armed struggle, and Mbeki and Mugabe, they are the sort of they're the guardians of that particular flame, which still burns very brightly in southern Africa. And I just wish that the countries of South would realise that it's not just Zimbabwe that's being damaged, but it's them as well. It's had an effect on tourism, and there's an effect on investment in the area, and of course potentially there are already 2 million refugees from Zimbabwe in South Africa. If there really was to be an outbreak of the kind of violence which is threatened, then South Africa could well be overrun by an enormous wave of refugees seeking escape from what was going on. So leave aside questions of principle. There's a really overwhelming pragmatic argument for the states of Southern Africa, including South Africa, to be putting pressure on Mugabe to accept the result of the election. And that's why David Miliband gave a written statement yesterday in the House of Commons which put that as strongly as I think anyone's done. Gordon Brown was strong about it in the United States. That's an area, back to your point, that's an area upon which all of the political parties can unite. What can we do, though? I mean, people say, well, you've intervened in Iraq. But, I mean, if you actually think about the notion of military action in Zimbabwe, it doesn't even bear thinking about. No question of host nation support or anything of that kind. Where would you do it from? You wouldn't have a mandate from the United Nations. It would be a potential nightmare. So military action simply doesn't appear on the table. Sanctions, the problem about sanctions is that the rich, the well-heeled, the powerful manage to evade the consequences of sanctions, whereas the poor who don't. That's why Britain's been right to go on with food supplies, things of that kind, in order to try and help the poorest people, who are the ones who suffered most. I think there's a huge amount of frustration about what we can or cannot do about Zimbabwe. But in the end, I think it's a problem which will require a regional solution. And for that, the countries of the region have the primary responsibility.
Okay. There's a woman just down here.
Thanks very much. Elizabeth Weller, National Audit Office. Given your background in sport...
Sorry, I missed your
from the National Audit Office, NAA. Right. Given your background in sport, I was just wondering what you thought about whether political leaders should attend the Olympic Games in Beijing this year.
Well, we decided about Beijing when we gave the Games to China. And I know undertakings were given to the International Olympic Committee about access, journalistic freedom and all of that. But anyone who knew anything about it knew that these were undertakings which were not legally enforceable in any way. I don't think it would make the slightest difference to China's policy towards Tibet if Gordon Brown stays away, or Sarkozy, or Angela Merkel, or anyone. Staying away will not change the policy towards Tibet. But I think the Olympic Games do offer an opportunity for the nations, the countries of the young people of the world, because that's the invocation. As the Games finish, the President of the IOC calls upon the youth of the world to assemble 4 years hence. The opportunity for young people to go to China and to say in the strongest possible terms what they believe about democracy and about the death penalty and about the rights of the people of Tibet to enjoy autonomy. And in that respect, the fact that the Dalai Lama, who is, by the way, going to come and give evidence to the Foreign Affairs Select Committee in due course, in that respect, we are helped, assisted, because of his insistence that the Games should not be the subject of boycott. I don't think you should boycott. I think you should go and you should persuade and you take every chance to make the case for for liberal democracy and democratic institutions. Stay away, and I think you will simply encourage the Chinese government in what is, frankly, to some extent, paranoia, and will make not a whit of difference to the fate and the aspirations of the people of Tibet. So go, but say the basis upon which you're going.
And what about those people who say, well, that just means that you give trade and commerce more importance than human rights?
Well, no one's arguing that we should break off trade links with China. No one's saying in relation to Tibet is so serious. So why take it out on sport? Why make sport the vehicle? If you're really serious, if you really do think that this is an impossible situation, that the moral issues are so overwhelming and compelling. And you say, right, well, we'll stop. We won't import all these Chinese toys at Christmas.
But that's why Gordon Brown is in such a difficult position, because he spent so much time wooing the Chinese.
Yeah, but we all have. I mean, we all have. I mean, you know, let he that is without sin cast the first stone.
The question just here at the front.
Hello, my name's Tim Less, and I'm at the Foreign Office, but I'm going to ask you a question about domestic politics. And my question is this. Do you think that the traditional categories of left and right still have any meaning in British politics? And if so, are the Lib Dems still the party of the centre?
It's a very good question. I think these categories are less significant than they once were. I mean, you know the old American point about politics. You should always define yourself, otherwise your opponent will define you. That's why John Kerry got lost an election. He almost certainly should have won the last presidential election. But these definitions, I think, in Britain are less easy than they once were. I mean, the so-called left, when I became a member of Parliament in 1987, there still were, forgive the cliche, horny-handed sons of there was a trade union element in the House of Commons, which has very largely gone. There were still Knights of the Shires on the Tory benches, which is very largely gone. These sort of conventional descriptions are much less relevant in our political system. And I would argue, wouldn't I, because I want to define myself and therefore define the political argument, I would argue that the test now really is whether you're a liberal with a small l or not. And David Cameron, if you may remember, went to great lengths, he doesn't do it so much now, to describe himself as a liberal conservative. And I've forgotten the figure of speech which that is, but it's a paradox, I always think. If I were to describe myself as a conservative liberal, you'd laugh at me. Someone describes himself as a liberal conservative. Why not have the same response? And it's a question of whether you think individual freedom and personal liberty is important, whether you think the state should be, putting it pejoratively, off people's backs, save to the extent which is absolutely essential. And my argument with Gordon Brown, if he were here, friend or no friend, is that he thinks that the centre is the place from which you exert all of these influences. Now, I'm a devolutionist. I believe in Home Rule for Scotland, greater devolution for Wales. I even believe in devolution for the English regions, if that's what they want, because I don't believe that Whitehall knows best. I don't believe that centralism is the way in which to run a modern democratic country. And I think these are the divisions now, rather than the old idea of nationalisation of the means of production, distribution and exchange, or unfettered free market capitalism. I mean, there is a sense, somehow Margaret Thatcher's name sprang into my mind. Margaret Thatcher talked right, but actually she governed centrist. I mean, lots of things which Blair did, Margaret Thatcher would never have dared to do. So maybe we've had that argument. Maybe, in a sense, this change has been taking place. The rhetoric may not have changed, but the substance has changed. And where are we? Well, we're a party of the centre-left. I mean, that's where I come from. Joe Grimond persuaded me to join the Liberal Party when I was 18. And then I read John Stuart Mill, and that was me. It's a bit like give me a Catholic child until he's 7. After that, there was no turning back. Twitch of the thread, all of that. And we are a party of the centre-left, and we should always remain so. There are people who, for, if you like, electoral advantage, suggest that we can somehow be a party of the centre-right. I don't believe in that, because I think liberalism has to have within it an element of radicalism, of a willingness to break down convention, which I don't think centre-right parties enjoy.
Okay, there's a question just here.
I'm Jasper Kane, I'm a student. A question about the London mayor elections. In light of the current polls, I was just wondering if you think perhaps the Lib Dems should have put forward a stronger candidate, and do you think the poor showing will have a detrimental effect on the party as a whole?
Well, who could be stronger than Brian Paddick? He's an outstanding candidate. But, I mean, this election's being fought out in the pages of the Evening Standard. And the Evening Standard hates Ken. And the Evening Standard, I'm not so sure the extent to which they love Boris, but because Boris looks to them to be a better bet to beat Ken, then the Evening Standard, for these purposes at least, loves Boris. And so Brian Paddick has had trouble breaking into the argument. But he's an outstanding career in the police, a man who's managed large budgets. If you're concerned about crime, which is a concern of people who live in London, then who better than a senior police officer to be responsible for that? I think, will the result affect things? Well, I mean, all results affect things. But will it condition our result in the next general election? No. Other factors will determine that. But we've got an outstanding candidate. I'm sorry that he hasn't had a better showing in the coverage that this election has had so far.
But if he had been a bigger figure, he might have got more coverage, perhaps.
Well, he is a pretty big, I mean, really, if you think about it, he is a pretty big figure. I mean, you know, is Brian Paddick a bigger figure than Boris? Well,
he's new to politics.
Yeah, sure.
He is new to politics.
But I mean, there's a real sense among the public that they don't like traditional politicians. Here's someone who isn't a traditional politician. I mean, do you think, when it comes to determining the issue of knife crime, that Boris Johnson is better qualified than Brian Paddick? So it's a rhetorical question.
Yeah, no, I'm not going to answer it.
It's rhetorical. I know. You were straining. Your objectivity was under siege for the moment.
No, it was quite safe. There's a lady here in the middle.
Thank you. Kathleen O'Hara, I'm a Canadian journalist.
Ah.
In Canada, the centre-left is very much against our participation in Afghanistan.
Yeah.
And I don't quite understand how you can reconcile being there. The Karzai government is considered corrupt. The Taliban is still winning the hearts and minds of a lot of people. I heard a NATO leader saying that. It just doesn't, it seems a little too self-serving. And I just want to know exactly why you are different from our center-left, because we are on the front lines.
Yes, of course. Well, and I think I acknowledged a little while ago, Canadians have proportionately lost more than others. And I was at a meeting of NATO parliamentarians not all that long ago in Brussels. And our Canadian colleagues, who were still supportive, those who were there, who were still supportive of the deployment, were making the point, though, that unless others take a share of the burden, then Canada will quite rightly say, well, we've done our bit, we're going to withdraw. Now, why do I think we should be there? Well, we should be there because, first of all, NATO invoked its Article 5, which is the responsibility to go to the assistance of any country which comes under attack. First time it had ever done it. The attack came out of Al-Qaeda based in Afghanistan. Perfectly legitimate, in my view. It's supported by United Nations resolution. Is it difficult? Of course it's difficult. But if Afghanistan fails, if it's a failed state, then the consequences for that region would be absolutely enormous. You have Pakistan, where, as Musharraf has discovered in recent weeks as a result of the election, there is by no means a consolidated view about the future of that country. It's a country which has nuclear weapons which, if they fell into the wrong hands, could be of an enormously destabilizing factor in the region. And therefore, it's essential, in my view, to, so far as we can, to win the case in Afghanistan for the stability not just of that country, but of the region as well. Is it easy? Of course it isn't easy. None of these things are, as the Russians will tell you, it was anything but easy. But walking out of Afghanistan, in my view, would be enormously damaging. It's different from Iraq. It's a different set of issues, but it's a place of incredible significance in which, having committed ourselves, we must try and see it through. But I think the Canadians will come out. I mean, I'm pretty clear about that in my own mind. That I think the Canadians will leave, and I think that will make that maybe the wake-up call which NATO requires.
We have a baby Bush. Sorry, we have a baby Bush government there, a right-wing sort of Republican-like government. So, if you were talking to parliamentarians, I hope they weren't from the government, because you wouldn't be getting the majority Canadian.
They were a mixture. I mean, I know public opinion is pretty fiercely against it. They were a mixture, liberals and conservatives.
Okay, I think that probably...
One at the back.
Okay, we have a couple of... Are you all right for time?
Yes, I'm okay.
It's 20 to 9. Lovely. Okay, one at the back, one here.
Helen Johnson, not affiliated. You've talked a lot about American leadership tonight, and I wondered when you thought that that international leadership might pass somewhere else, for example, to China or India or somewhere else.
I'm sorry, there was some traffic noise.
You were talking about American leadership internationally and how important that is, and I wondered whether you had a view on when that leadership might pass to, for example, China or India or anywhere else.
No. There's a kind of, it's not Campbell's law, but I think there's a kind of law that when countries make economic progress, they begin to look for political influence. India's perhaps a less emotive illustration than China, because the Indian case for permanent membership of the Security Council of the United Nations is now being pressed enormously hard, and I think with justification. And China, making these enormous economic advances, is spending money on defense like you wouldn't believe, not all of it publicly acknowledged. And that's not going, so long as the economic change persists, then these aspirations are not going to go away. China's active in Africa. We know that, to our cost, and Darfur and other places. India, I think, is perhaps less likely to act unilaterally, more likely to be multilateral than unilateral, but nonetheless likely to be a country of burgeoning influence. I'm not sure I see it. I'm not sure I've thought about it in the sense of China exercising leadership, because I don't think that, I think influence maybe, but I think China will want to exercise influence, but I'm not sure it will want to take on the responsibilities of leadership. And there is a very sharp distinction between the two. I think India can be brought into this rules-based system that I was talking about, but I don't have a clear view as to the evolution of China in these matters. I mean, one thing is certain. There's a lot going on below the surface in China, food riots, an increasing divide between those who have profited from the economic advance and those who haven't. And just as there's a kind of law about countries advancing economically and therefore wanting more political influence, there's also, of course, quite a lot of history of as countries develop economically, they develop if you like, a bourgeoisie which wants political influence. It's, I suppose, in one sense, but not exactly parallel. It's perestroika followed by glasnost, or the two going together. Now, they're very chary about that because they look at Russia and they say, well, running the two together was not in Russia's best interest. But I'm not sure that you can resist forever glasnost in that sense. And I think, therefore, there may be, if you like, internal pressures in China which would make the exercise of the kind of leadership you're talking about very difficult. I mean, one of the interesting things about the United States, I think, I mean, we're enormously, we're so superior, us Brits, aren't we? But you go into an American classroom, there's a flag in the corner. And the first thing they do every morning is they pledge allegiance to the flag. And if you look around the class, in some parts Hispanic, Afro-Caribbean, Eastern European, Anglo-Saxon, North American, South American. They have a sense of integration, of belongingness, which we simply don't have in this country. And it seems to me if you have that, then perhaps you're more fitted for external leadership. If you're divided at home, then leadership abroad, I think, is much more difficult to achieve. So it's what they did on 9/11. And if you think about 9/11, you actually think about it. If two aircraft flew into the House of Commons, some people might think that was a good thing. Sorry, I shouldn't make a joke about something as serious. But if you think about the psychological impact of that on a country, and if the Pentagon, which has kind of iconic status, and yet, in spite of Bush's difficulties, and I mean, I have some sympathy for him because I've no doubt the system said go away, stay away. The preservation of the head of state is almost the single most. Why Secret Service agents take bullets on behalf, not just in films, but in real life, on behalf of the president. And yet, within 48 hours, this quite extraordinary country had somehow pulled itself together in a way which sort of demonstrated a determination not to be divided one against the other. And it's a remarkable phenomenon, the United States. And although we are critical of it, and I've been certainly critical of it in the past, I nonetheless have an enormous admiration for it as well.
So it sounds like the answer is not sometime soon. The answer to the original question is it's not going to happen now.
Not sometime
There's
soon.
one question just down here, and then I think we'll draw it to a close.
Simon Taylor, a builder. Whose fault is it that politics has become so theatrical, and how can this be reversed?
Reeta Chakrabarti's.
No, that's not fair.
No, it's not fair. It's not fair, no. Well, I mean, if you go back and you look at Prime Minister's Question Time in the sort of 50s and 60s, people used to ask perfectly sensible questions about coal production, you know, for the forthcoming year. And the Prime Minister of the day would get up and say, well, I anticipate so many thousand, 100,000 tons. And the person who asked to go would say, thank you very much. It changed, I think, Harold Wilson, the Wilson-Alec Douglas-Hume exchanges, when Wilson, who was very quick, very clever, wanted to take advantage of Alec Hume being a gent, an aristocrat, a lord who'd given up his peerage. And I suppose you would argue that Margaret Thatcher took it on. I mean, her exchanges with, I think with Jim Callaghan she found it difficult, but with Neil, who never quite understood how to deal with this Boadicea. You know, Owen Glendower could not deal with Boadicea. And it developed. You could see it developing. And then if you have someone like Blair, who's enormously accomplished, who gets 10 years at it, then it's not surprising it becomes theatrical, I think. Will it go back? Highly unlikely. It's a performance. And rightly or wrongly, it's what political journalists write about. Because the day after Prime Minister's Questions, don't read the news unless it's been something very dramatic. Read the sketch writers. To be fair to the electronic media, they're less concerned about they're more concerned with the substance. But I think it's part of a kind of celebrity, a whole variety of factors. 24-hour-a-day news. You have to fill 24-hour-a-day news. So something new, something different, a different dimension. Personalities. I mean, Harold Macmillan's wife carried on a relationship with Bob Boothby for what, 20 years? No one ever thought it right, or dared even to print a line about it. It's also the sort of reduction in deference, which I rather support. There's an intrusiveness about the lives of people in public life. I think when you wrap all that up together, it's perhaps not surprising that it goes theatrical in the way that it has. Is it good or bad? The public love it. My American friends stay at home on Sunday nights to watch C-SPAN. Gee, we have nothing like this at home. Well, they don't, because if you've ever been in the Senate, you've been in the House of Representatives, you know, people reading speeches into the record for the Daily Gleaner at home, nothing at all to do with the issue. It's quite a different style of politics. I think it'd be very difficult for us to go back.
But they have the ultimate showman, who was Clinton, so Clinton and Blair together.
Oh, pair. Clinton and Blair, it could be, they could sort of, what do you call it? Oh, God. Not the Christmas shows with...
Morecambe and Wise.
Yes, Morecambe and Wise. The Morecambe and Wise of world politics, Clinton and Blair. Actually, that's not fair to either of them, because they're both much more profound than that. I mean, Blair, we've been critical of Blair, haven't we? I mean, Blair's Chicago speech, which Gordon Brown's speech this week was supposed to emulate, Blair's Chicago speech is a very, very interesting piece of work. I mean, there's some very interesting stories how it came about.
This is about intervening.
Yes, about intervening, which the Canadians turned from the right to intervene into the duty to protect. I mean, they made an enormous contribution, Canadian foreign policy experts, by turning it round in a way which I think made it much more understandable and much more acceptable. I mean, that's a great speech from Blair. Although there's a kind of amusing account, whether this is true or not, no one knows, but it said that a professor at London University happened to be in number 10, and someone said to him, listen, Tony's got to make this speech next week in Chicago. Have you any ideas? To which it is said he got out an envelope, wrote a few ideas down. But I think that's a very profound piece of work, in my view, in the end. And Clinton, too, when really addressing issues, had an enormous weight about him. So I think we have to be, I mean, this is the politicians' club, sort of sticking up for itself. I think we have to be careful about dismissing people of that kind, because they have, look, we all have faults. They have faults, but both of them had substance as well. I mean, it's like LBJ, who, if any of you ever, there's a series of 4 volumes of biography. I'm trying to remember the name of the American writer everyone's hoping he'll survive to write the last volume, which is about LBJ in the White House. Johnson's capacity for passing civil rights legislation was unequaled by anyone. Built on the Kennedy tradition, Kennedy achievements. But it was absolutely extraordinary. And Johnson had this terrible reputation for vulgarity, for corruption in Texas, for corruption in Washington. I mean political corruption. And yet, when you look at what he did, he transformed the United States in terms of civil rights. Shakespeare, the evil that men do lives after them, the good is oft interred with their bones.
We've ranged far and wide, I think, haven't we?
Yeah.
Campbell, thank you for being so interesting. Thank you very much.